You're on TV.
All right.
Do we have?
Mr. Chair, we do have quorum for the meeting.
Fantastic, thank you.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to lead off with the opening speech?
Yeah, I suppose I'll go ahead and welcome people and then turn it over to you. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good to me.
Fantastic. Let me know when it's time, please.
I believe we are live right now.
Okay, great. Good evening and welcome to the July 20th meeting of the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission. Before getting started, I'd like to ask our moderator, Kyle Kobe, to give us an introduction to the rules of engagement for this evening's Zoom meeting.
Thank you very much. My name is Kyle Kobe and I'll be facilitating the Zoom video portion of the meeting tonight. With me here is Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. We will work alongside the chair, who is on remote video, to facilitate the meeting proceedings. Currently, I have everyone muted so we can talk through the general ground rules for tonight's meeting. The meeting is being broadcast live on the city's YouTube channel and public access cable channel 25. During the meeting, please mute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon found in the lower left-hand corner of the Zoom menu next to the video icon. When you are muted, a red line will appear over that icon. This will make it easier for everyone to hear the meeting. Just remember to unmute if and when you want to speak. In the menu, you can also turn your camera on or off by clicking the video icon located next to the microphone icon. For the purposes of this public meeting, please keep your video on for the duration. If you are participating by phone, you can enter *6 to mute and unmute your phone. Somewhere on your Zoom screen, you will also see a choice to toggle between speaker and gallery view. Speaker view shows the active speaker. Gallery view tiles all of the meeting participants. Be aware that we will not be screen sharing as a part of the meeting this evening. All attachments, reference materials, and submissions from the public are included in the agenda packet. A few reminders to ensure the provisions of the Kansas Open Meetings Act are met. Commissioners, you must state your name and title each time you speak. Members of city staff must also state their name and title each time they speak. I would also ask that applicants and members of the public identify themselves each time before they speak to ensure that everyone is able to follow along. Individuals who signed up in advance to provide public comments remotely will be called upon by name. When you are called on, please unmute your listening device and state your name before speaking. The chair will then call for in-person public comment for those who are physically present. Staff will direct you to the podium to speak while following social distancing and safety protocols. All motions will need to be stated clearly. After a motion is made and seconded, staff will call on each commissioner individually to provide their vote. Staff will then need to announce whether the motion carried and the count of the vote. I want to again remind everyone to please mute yourself when you are not speaking. I'll now turn the meeting back over to the chair.
Thank you, Kyle. To get started with this evening's meeting, I'd like to go ahead and receive and amend or approve the minutes from the June 22nd and 24th meetings. Those would have been distributed in today's update of the agenda packet. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to review those minutes. And would anyone like to make any amendments or changes to the minutes from those meetings? Commissioner Sinclair.
I move that we approve them.
Okay, thank you. Just a point of order. Jeff, do we need to approve the individual minutes separately, or can we approve both at once?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. They can be both approved at the same time if you would like.
Fantastic, thank you. David Carter, Chair. Do I have a second to approve the minutes? Commissioner Ashworth, we have a second, Commissioner Ashworth. All in favor? Oh, I guess, Jeff, could I ask you to read the roll, please?
Certainly. Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Commissioner Ashworth?
Yes.
Commissioner Butler? Excuse me. Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes.
Commissioner Carter?
Yes.
Commissioner Payton?
Yes.
Commissioner Sands?
Yes.
Commissioner Sinclair?
Yes.
Commissioner Struckoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Willy?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0.
Thank you, Jeff. David Carter, Chair. At this point, I'd like to ask if there are any reports from committees that have met over the past month. Unlikely, but possible. Okay, with that, Jeff, can you tell me if we have received any written communications from the public that are not already in this morning's update to the packet?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. All communications are a part of your packet this evening.
Thank you. David Carter, Chair. At this point, do we have any written communications from staff, planning commissioners, or other commissioners that we need to share with the public?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. We do not.
Thank you. David Carter, Chair. At this point, do we have any written action or any waivers or requests or determinations made by the city engineer?
Jeff Crick, Planning Director. We do not.
Okay, great. David Carter, Chair, do we have any ex parte communications that any commissioners need to declare at this point? Commissioner Willy.
This is Commissioner Willy. Yes, I had a conversation with Renee Cool about item number 3, about tiny houses as a housing solution, and also about the occupancy limits on the project. And she is here and will speak to all of those items and more, I'm sure.
Very good, thank you. Any others? Okay, do we have any declarations of abstention from any specific agenda items by commissioners? Okay, seeing none. At this point, we are available for general public comment. Kyle, I don't see anyone in the commission chambers, is that correct?
Kyle Kobe with Planning, that is correct.
Very good. David Carter, Chair. We also don't have anyone who had signed up in advance for general public comment. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our regular agenda item 1. That is consider approving a preliminary plat for Cedar Grove Subdivision number 1, located at 1209 Research Park Drive. And I believe we've got Sandy to give a presentation.
Good evening, Sandy Day, Planning. This preliminary plat follows the recent rezoning for the property to RM12D. The preliminary plat includes a new local street designed to provide access to the duplex residential lots on the northwest corner of Research Park Drive and Legends Drive. The City Commission considered the rezoning and approved the change from IBP to RM12D. The project includes 15 new lots to be developed with duplex units that would result in a total of 30 units, the overall density being around 7 dwelling units per acre. The average lot size is over 12,000 square feet. The proposed residential development complies with the subdivision design standards described in the staff report. Public improvement plans would be required with the project, which would come forward with the final plat as a future application to the department. I know the applicant is here with you this evening as well, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sandy. David Carter, Chair. Mr. Maurer, would you like to make any comments?
We agree with staff. It was a nice report. We don't have any comments unless you guys have questions about this little project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Maurer. David Carter, Chair. We don't have anyone signed up for public comment. Again, Kyle, could I confirm there's no one who's arrived to offer comment at this point?
Kyle Kobe with Planning, I can confirm that.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to the commission. Anyone like to make any observations or pose any questions to staff or the applicant? I would also entertain a motion if someone would like to present that. Commissioner Willy.
This is Commissioner Willy. So when we had the rezoning that came to us, and I expressed some concerns about losing the employment center zoning there, but now that the City Commission has agreed to the rezoning, I think the preliminary plat looks fine. I don't have any reservations with it. It looks like a fairly good fit.
Thank you, Commissioner Willy. David Carter, Chair. Any other questions, observations? Motions? Commissioner Sands.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend approval of the preliminary plat for Cedar Grove Subdivision Number 1, subject to the approval and publication of ordinance number 9771 to rezone the property. Well, I'm sorry. Let me stop myself there. Jeff, do I need to state it as written? Or do we need to amend that a little bit?
Jeff, can you clarify?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Commissioner Sands, it would probably be that you would want to state the action requested as noted on the staff report there. The initial item was published with a variance that is no longer required, but there is a condition about a revised traffic impact study prior to it. So the action requested on the executive summary cover sheet of the item would be correct.
Okay. So let me restart that, please. I apologize to everyone for that.
Okay.
Make a recommendation to approve the preliminary plat for Cedar Grove Subdivision Number 1, subject to the approval and publication of ordinance number 9771 to rezone the property from IBP to RM12D and subject to the following condition: that the applicant shall submit a revised traffic impact study for review and approval prior to the submission of the final plat for this property to provide trip generation for the approved land use in the comprehensive plan and net difference between the proposed development.
Thank you, Commissioner Sands. Do I have a second? Commissioner Willy, by a hand motion. David Carter, Chair. Any further discussion? All right. Jeff, could I ask you to read the roll, please?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Certainly. Commissioner Ashworth?
Did you not hear that? Yes.
All right. Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes.
Commissioner Carter?
Yes.
Commissioner Payton?
Yes.
Commissioner Sands?
Yes.
Commissioner Sinclair?
Yes.
Commissioner Struckoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Willy?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0.
Thank you, Jeff. David Carter, Chair. That brings us to item number 2. Consider approving a special use permit to allow healthcare office and healthcare clinic as a possible use for 1307 Massachusetts Street. Kyle, I believe you're giving a presentation this evening?
Yes, sir. Kyle Kobe with Planning. This special use permit proposes to amend the existing SUP 19-00389, to add healthcare office, healthcare clinic to the list of approved uses for 1307 Massachusetts Street. No other changes are proposed at this time. All previously approved uses and conditions for the property will remain. Special use permits for adaptive reuse require review and recommendation by the Historic Resources Commission prior to hearing by the Planning Commission. At their regular meeting on June 18th, 2020, the Historic Resources Commission voted unanimously to recommend approval. Staff also recommends approval of SUP 20-00155. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Kyle. David Carter, Chair. I believe we have Mr. Winter here to speak. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. Went Winter, court-appointed custodian and receiver for the Views Crest Foundation, owner of this property. I will speak if spoken to.
Very good. Thank you, sir. We don't have anyone signed up for public comment this evening. Kyle, could I ask you once again to please confirm no one's arrived to offer comment on this item?
Kyle Kobe with Planning. I can confirm that.
Thank you, Kyle. David Carter, Chair. With that, I'll turn it over to the Commission. Any questions or comments for the for staff or for the applicant? I guess if there are no other questions, I'd like to ask just for a clarification. Kyle, could you please offer some clarification on this currently allows office uses but not healthcare office uses. Is there any particular distinction that we should be noting here?
Kyle Kobe with Planning. The distinction is made in the Land Development Code. This was a conversation that we had with the applicant prior to the special use permit application. There are some components of office uses and the healthcare office use where there's some overlap, but the code is fairly clear in where it differentiates between the two. which is why there's the need to update the special use permit to allow for this use per the regulations and the definitions contained within the Land Development Code.
Thank you, Kyle. David Carter, Chair. Any other questions? Commissioner Sinclair.
Luke Sinclair, Planning Commissioner. One question I have is there was an email from the public that raised, I guess, question about parking. It wasn't very specific, but is there much difference at all between the addition of this use, I guess this particular use, and the uses that are already in the SUP that we already approved, relevant to parking that we ought to be concerned about?
Kyle Kobe with Planning. The parking impact for this use would be the same or less than all of the other uses that are already permitted in the special use permit. In the special use permit that's on file for the property at this time. There's no proposed changes based on this use. The intent is to preserve the existing conditions and character of the property as it is now. And staff feels that all of the uses we should be able to accommodate those as they are all the same as or equal to or less than the previous use that had been in place there for some time prior to.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you. Commissioner Carpenter.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. Kyle, could you just briefly reiterate what the existing conditions on the special use permit are?
Kyle Kobe with Planning. Give me 1 second while I pull those up. So the existing, Kyle Kobe with Planning, the existing conditions that are contained in the existing special use permit, you'll be able to see in the attachment in your agenda packet. On the right-hand side, there's a column containing conditions of approval. These conditions are taken out of the Land Development Code for each individual use. And the small event center use conditions were also carried forward in light of the previous special use permit that was in place for the property prior to SUP 19. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the number. SUP 19-00389. So all of the conditions that we have on here are conditions that are standard within the Land Development Code and that were in place prior to the previous special use permit. The reason why there are no conditions proposed for the healthcare office, healthcare clinic use is that the Land Development Code doesn't contain any specific guidance in the same way that it does for the uses that have conditions on the plan right now.
Thank you, Kyle. David Carter, Chair. Commissioner Carpenter, does that address your question?
I just wanted, Jim Carpenter's Planning Commissioner, I just wanted those reiterated in case anybody was watching this and didn't have access to the whole packet.
Thank you very much. David Carter, Chair. Any other questions? Commissioner Sands.
Rob Sands, Commissioner. Question for Kyle or staff. If I recall correctly, the last time we saw action on this property, or maybe it was 2 times before, don't quote me, was there not an agreement for shared use parking on an adjoining plat or lot, or am I making that up?
Kyle Kobe with Planning. I know at one point in time there was, I believe at one point in time there was a shared parking agreement in place. My recollection of that is that that shared parking agreement is no longer officially in place at this time. Wint might be able to fill in some extra details on this for me, but my understanding is there is no shared use agreement with a adjoining property right now, but this would not prevent such an agreement from being put in place at some point in the future.
Okay, so this use as it stands now, staff's estimate is that that the use will not mess up the parking arithmetic for that property?
Kyle Kobe with planning, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I could ask Mr. Winter, was there anything you'd like to say to confirm Kyle's comments?
Yes, thank you. Winter, court-appointed custodian. There was an agreement, a cross-parking agreement between this property when Libby was alive. That was with McElwain Mortuaries, sorry. That mortuary has since sold to a gentleman named Jim Larkin. Mr. Larkin and I met, and happily he agreed to allow this property to use 6 of the easternmost parking spaces on a lot that he owns, which is directly across the alley from this property. That agreement is in writing. However, it is not signed. There is no recorded easement, so he could withdraw that. But he's been very gracious in his assistance with us as we move to stabilize this historic property.
Thank you, Mr. Winter. David Carter, Chair. Commissioner Sands, does that address your question? Very good. Commissioner Ashworth.
No question. I'm just pleased that something has been found for this historic structure, and I can make a motion if we're ready.
Please.
I move, Sharon Ashworth, Planning Commissioner, I move that we recommend approval of special use permit for the adaptive reuse of designated historic property to add healthcare office, healthcare clinic as a permitted use at 1307 Massachusetts Street, and forwarding that recommendation to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval based on the findings presented in the body of the staff report and subject to the following condition in the staff report.
Thank you, David Carter, Chair. Do I have a second? Commissioner Payden, by hand motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none. Jeff, may I ask you to read the roll, please?
Certainly. Jeff Crick, Planning Development Services Director. Commissioner Ashworth.
Yes.
Commissioner Carpenter.
Yes.
Commissioner Carter.
Yes.
Commissioner Payden.
Yes.
Commissioner Sands.
Yes.
Commissioner Sinclair.
Yes.
Commissioner Struckoff.
Yes.
Commissioner Willy.
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0.
Thank you, Jeff. David Carter, Chair, that brings us to item 3, consider approving a special use permit for 12 dwelling units at 3655 East 25th Street for the Lawrence Community Shelter. And Sandy, I believe you've got a presentation for us?
Yes, thank you. Sandy Day, Planning. The property is located in southeast Lawrence and is developed with the Lawrence Community Shelter. Property is zoned PID, and it's the last remaining part of that original zoning. The surrounding zoning includes GPI, or the Douglas County Jail to the west, IG, which is the Douglas County Public Works and Zoning Codes Office, and their mechanical shops to the east and south. And then the area to the north, along the north side of East 25th Street, is zoned IG and is also vacant. Surrounding area is industrial in nature and character. Lawrence Community Shelter has operated at this location since their approval of the special use permit in 2010. The project was approved with a maximum capacity of 125 people with an ability to expand service up to 140 people during cold weather during specific temperatures. The current application does not modify the use or the capacity. The request does modify the physical site plan component of the special use permit by the addition of the 12 detached residential units that would allow for separate temporary shelter for either families or for individuals needing to be isolated because of health needs. The majority of the population would continue to be sheltered within the main building. The new units would be added to the rear of the site, would not affect the required off-street parking or minimum open space area required for the site. Site plan would replace the previous earlier versions for this property and would not alter the capacity restrictions of the framework of the management plan, which was updated to include these units. Project will require extension of water and sewer lines to serve these units and will also be subject to building and fire code through the building permit process. Now, the applicant's representatives are here this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sandy. David Carter, Chair. I believe we've got three members of the team for the applicant that are all present this evening. We have Renee Cool, Megan Bond, and Dan Rockhill. And you have a total of 10 minutes for your comments. I don't know who would like to speak first. Renee Cool, you're listed first. Would you like to say anything in response?
Sure. Thank you all for having us. And then it would be great if Dan could speak as well. And Dan can certainly, if you guys have any questions about the building aspects or design of the dwelling units that we're planning, he's your expert. But as far as the purpose and mission of the project, it's really to just address our need to provide more private, healthy, sanitary sheltering spaces for folks in the midst of this pandemic. Long term, with all the hope that very soon we'll have a COVID-19 vaccine and or a viable treatment, we'll be able to shelter families in these units, and that's going to provide the families that we assist with, again, more privacy, a more trauma-informed, quieter, peaceful place to recover from homelessness, get their basic needs met, and then plan their stabilization and plan their transition to permanent housing. So we will be using them as emergency shelter units. They're not intended to be long-term permanent housing, and they're not intended even to be prolonged transitional housing. The time frame in which people will use these would be 1 to 6 months. So, and then we would use that time to do what we do with folks, which is help them assess their barriers to permanent housing and find ways to resolve them. So I'm super just excited by this partnership that we've created with Dan, and I'm just really excited also for his generosity, and so grateful for his generosity. And it just really could not have come at a more urgent time for us. And if we can get this online in our very ambitious timeline, then we'll be sheltering a lot more people by January than we are now. So just really excited to share information with you all about the project.
Thank you very much. David Carter, Chair. Ms. Bond or Mr. Rockhill, would you like to follow up?
I can follow with a few comments. This is an opportunity to help out. I think we have a tremendous homeless problem here in the city, and I saw the opportunity. It actually came about before the virus. There had been an article in the paper about how staff at LCS was struggling to accommodate, families, basically moms with 2 toddlers and an infant on her arms, and living in what I would call large gymnasium-like conditions. They just didn't seem right. And so anything we can do to help, I'm happy to contribute. We're a not-for-profit corporation, that being Studio 804. I think many of you are familiar with the fact that we are a corporation under the umbrella of the School of Architecture at the University of Kansas. And I've been working with Studio 804 for 25 years. We've been able to generate a savings account, and from that account, we're able to draw to help out with this problem. And so that's the direction we've taken. We hope to begin. Of course, the virus can change all of this very quickly, but we're keeping our fingers crossed with proper distancing and masks, et cetera, taking temperatures every day. We can begin as early as September on construction and be through certainly by the spring. All of the students that I have are graduate students who will graduate by May. So that's kind of my deadline as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Professor Rockhill. David Carter, Chair. Kyle, we don't have any public comments. We have members of the public signed up to comment in advance. Can you tell me if there's anyone in the commission chambers to speak this evening?
Kyle Kobe with planning. There is no one here to speak on this item this evening.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. David Carter, Chair. I'll turn it back over to the commission then. Would anyone like to offer any questions for staff or for the applicants? Commissioner Willy.
Dan, could I ask you to talk a little bit about the construction technique? I think this is a first that we've had. I'm a little bit aware of the use of shipping containers for housing, and I think that's what this is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Happily, it seemed to me that the fastest way for us to solve the problem of creating space was to purchase shipping containers, containers that have had some limited use, not terribly rusty, and then we outfit those in order to create the accommodations. We meet the insulation requirements, we meet the egress requirements. The fire prevention chief has asked that we use a sprinkler system in these buildings as well. But it seemed to me as a fast way for us to go ahead and address this problem. And at the same time, I think give some dignity to the occupants by being able to isolate and live on their own. They are done in a duplex. If you've seen the plan, they're actually two that are separated by a patio and a cover over them. And my hope is that if we can get this first dozen in place, I would be completely open to continuing. If the community is interested in this as a solution or some variation on this theme, I'd be very interested in continuing this, be it at LCS or anywhere else in town. So I realize I'm not explaining it terribly well, but to meet all of the ADA requirements, all of the egress requirements, everything that the city has asked for, we're pretty limited to cramming a couple of beds, in the rooms, meeting the toilet needs, as well as a small little kitchenette and a living quarter with a fold-out sofa. But they do present some sanctuary, I think, from the alternative, which is being in the gymnasium-like condition that I described earlier.
Thank you, Professor Rockhill. Commissioner Ashworth?
Commissioner Ashworth, it looks like they sleep 4. Can you tell me what the maximum occupancy is?
It will be 2 adults and 2 children, or 1 adult and 3 children. And typically, so no more than 2 adults ever in any unit. And we anticipate that if we have bigger families, on occasion, we might have 2 adults with 5 kids is probably the largest family we've had. We would put them in the duplex with 1 adult in each one. And so typically our family makeup at the shelter is usually a single mom with 2 or 3 kids under the age of 5. So this is kind of designed with that family unit in mind.
Thank you, Ms. Cool. David Carter, Chair. Any other questions? Commissioner Willy.
Commissioner Willy, so I had a question for either Professor Rockhill or Renee Cool, whoever would like to answer this. How many of these units are planned to be accessible units? And it looked as though, just with the space requirements, that there weren't showers in the accessible units. Can we talk a little bit about that and what the alternatives are for people?
I can answer that. The plan, I'm not sure which plan you received. I know the one that I noticed in the newspaper was slightly out of date. We just, all of these things go through multiple iterations. The ADA unit, for which there is only one, does have an accessible shower, and I don't believe that was shown in the plan properly. But the other 12 all have proper facilities. So, or the other 11, I should say. The one is the ADA unit that is separate, and that just is just to meet code.
Thank you very much. David Carter, Chair. Other questions? Commissioner Willy.
Hi, me again, Commissioner Willy. Renee Cool, Ms. Cool, can I ask you to talk about, there was no ask for an increase in capacity with adding these units, and so I imagine it's just for the flexibility of being able to isolate and such, and you and I had a bit of this conversation earlier, so I want to make sure that that's available to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, our current zoning and capacity works for this project. We are really trying to reorganize how we are sheltering people and improve the conditions in which people are sheltered. And our ability to shelter more than 120 people would require us to bring on more staff. So at this point, I don't anticipate us over the long term having access to more operating funds to fund the staff supervision. We do have some increase coming in personnel from an AmeriCorps grant, and that will help us supervise folks, located in a different geography. And that's part of our security plan for the tiny house village. And we'll also have security cameras and things like that, which will help us supervise the space. But yeah, beyond that, it just takes so many social work resources and so many social workers to properly assist 120 people. So at this point, although I would welcome as much money as anyone wants to give us, I don't, the tea leaves are not telling me that's what's happening. So that's why we haven't sought an increase in the special use permit. And in the meantime, inside our existing facility, we have spaced everyone out so that they have social distancing. The dorms are much less crowded. And so for the duration of this pandemic context, inside of the existing warehouse, we'll continue to shelter individual men and women, but they'll have a lot more space, and we'll continue to make the adjustments and accommodations that we've made to support or prevent COVID-19 transmission inside.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cool. David Carter, Chair. Other questions? Commissioner Carpenter.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. This is your questions to Jeff. Back in 2016, there was talk about tiny houses, and at that time, we didn't have any guidance in our code for those. They were coming up. I know Kansas City, Missouri had them at that time, and they're going to be looked at there. So we're essentially asked to approve a tiny house community here tonight by a special use permit. How are we going to address this when somebody else comes in and asks in the future? Do we have clear guidance for that? Because again, back in 2016, no work had been done on this because nobody had asked for it yet, was what we were getting from staff at that time. So where are we in putting together standards for tiny house communities?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. We've made a lot of progress since 2016. When you talk about a tiny house development like this, there's really two sets of codes that come into play. The first one is the Land Development Code, and there's multiple avenues that we think are very viable in the way that they could be developed and come out into the world. You could look at something like an RS3 zoning district. You could also look at something very similar to what we do with other projects, that is a RM zoning district that requires a special use permit or a further permit upon it to kind of go down a line very similar to what we're seeing this evening. So we think the land development code details are worked out and available in some respects. It's just a matter of which way an applicant would like us to proceed in that line. The other side of the coin is the building permits. There are minimum requirements for habitable space, bathrooms, bedrooms, and other items in there. As part of that review that we started back in 15, 16, we started looking at the codes to see what those minimums would be. And so we've had a lot of time to kind of look at that as part of our code process and also as part of our code updating process to make sure that we fully understood those details. So we think we've come a pretty long ways in trying to kind of work those items into the community. It just really depends in some respects on the way that an application is brought forward, if it is related to a certain zoning district or if there's a certain end product that they are striving to achieve.
Thank you, Jeff. Commissioner Carpenter, please.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commission. It's hard not to say chair after a year, so I'm sorry. There's a pause every time here. Jeff, I guess this question is about building codes. The closest analogy to using shipping containers would be mobile homes. I assume these are going to be anchored to the ground, and what provisions are being made for storm shelters as such?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. I know that there is mounting requirements to the ground that our Building Safety Division is taking a look at as part of their reviews. I'm not fully versed in the full details of what the anchoring requirements for the code are. As far as storm shelters, I would have to defer to the applicant on that one. I'm not sure I know enough about the project in totality to speak to that aspect.
I can. Yeah, we have no plans for the units themselves. The units, of course, will be anchored per the building code. But other than that, we can't really get anything inside the units. We can barely get beds in the units. We're doing what we can. Renee, you may have something to add to it.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you, Dan. We don't have plans for an outdoor storm shelter at this time. We do have a storm sheltering tornado plan and which layout inside the existing facility where we direct folks in the event of a tornado. So storm sheltering would happen as of now inside of our existing warehouse. And so I'm hopeful. You know, that being said, like I think storm sheltering at LCS is a really important conversation that, you know, we need help with from the community. But for now, because we're not expanding our capacity, the plan, we have enough room in our existing storm sheltering plan to bring people inside.
Thank you, Ms. Cool. I actually have a question, David Carter, Chair. I have a question, I'm not sure for whom, about an item in the management plan about security. It mentions security at the village will be monitored via the 4K security camera system. Could you elaborate a little bit on the placement of the cameras? Is that actually in the dwelling units or is that in the public spaces?
No, we won't put cameras inside of the dwelling units. However, you know, our families up until now, we have had like pretty extensive cameras in their dorm and have had camera monitoring of families, even kind of when they're doing their own thing. But these will not have cameras inside of them. Part of the purpose is to afford people privacy, a different kind of privacy. And we think that that's more what's called trauma informed for them and more empowering for them. So we will put them around our parking lot and around the facility, just around the village area. So yeah, we have the ability to retain on our new updated camera system up to 2 weeks of footage at any time. And that's how we monitor the facility now with staff trained to monitor cameras.
Thank you very much. David Carter, Chair. Commissioner Ashworth.
Ashworth, in the discussion you had with Commissioner Carpenter about the tiny home, the definition of a tiny home, and will this project inform a definition of tiny home? I guess that is for Jeff.
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. It's, if I understand the commissioner's question correctly, would this inform our interpretation of a tiny home? Is that correct?
Yes, Commissioner Ashworth, just is there a definition of a tiny home anywhere? And if not, would this inform that definition?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. There's not a land development code specific definition for a tiny home. A tiny home actually falls under the definition of a detached dwelling in the land development code in many respects. So a lot of our code language we have currently available would allow us to do it because they're not size specific on the size of the dwelling units. The sizes in the dwelling units are usually a derivative of the building code's application to the structures.
Commissioner Ashworth, does that address your question? Thank you. David Carter, Chair. Any other questions? Commissioner Carpenter.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. That all raises the question on tying these to accessory dwelling units. What happens when we get the first request to put a shipping container in someone's backyard as an accessory dwelling unit? Is our code set up to address those types of issues?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Commissioner, I believe it would. It's the guidance that is there in the accessory dwelling unit portion of the use regulations requires certain design elements to be in place, size limitations and those details there. It doesn't get down to the architectural nature of construction or the materials necessarily that are used to kind of reach to that point. We've had people investigate that as part of different housing units in the community, and for many reasons they've chosen to go other directions, but we think the use regulations in the code would give clear guidance on what is expected if somebody was to establish one of those as an accessory dwelling unit.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. Thanks, Jeff. I'm just I'm all on board with the idea of tiny homes. I'm sure, but we're going to be having these discussions about accessory dwelling units, and you've mentioned what types of zonings would accommodate these now. What about other zoning districts with special use permits that could end up with a structure similar to this in the backyard?
Sorry, Commissioner Carpenter, is that directed to Jeff?
Yeah.
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. There's a lot of different avenues when you go to establish dwelling units inside the city. Depends on your zoning districts, and there has to be certain criteria that you're looking to meet. There is certain levels, accessory dwelling units can only happen in certain RS zoning districts if if one of the occupants is the owner of the property. So if you think about an accessory dwelling unit, if the principal residence is a rental unit, then the accessory dwelling unit is no longer valid in the way that it works. So the owner has to live on the parcel for the accessory dwelling unit to be activated. The detached dwelling is a kind of a house that we tend to see in those items there. So if it was to go through under the lines of a detached dwelling and be designed in a way that was compliant with the definition in section 201734, you would be able to come up to that item there. We've also seen some different development patterns in the community. I think you're seeing a little bit more, I would call them duplex for the lack of a better word. It's a larger kind of cluster development that is mainly duplex or triplex developments that usually can come in either through the premise of a special use permit or a site plan, depending upon where they're locating in the community. So there's a lot of different kind of routes that a residence can take to come into the land development code. It really comes down to very similar to kind of what we're talking about with the application before you this evening. what is the underlying zoning and what is that ultimate product going to look like. In the case of the community shelter, it's not really a dwelling unit they're looking to sell on to somebody else. It is part of their overall mission and what they're working to do on the property there. If someone was to develop a tiny house development in some kind, there are different ways that could kind of take root and show up in form. It just depends on what that ultimate end product that they're looking to have available on the market would be.
Thank you, Jeff. David Carter, Chair. Commissioner Willy.
Commissioner Willy. I'm excited to have these conversations. I think this is something that's been in the works kind of in other communities for a while, and I think this is a chance for us to try it on for size and see, what can be done with it and how well we like it. And I think it's a great use to start with at the shelter, and it gives them some flexibility, especially around being able to isolate people when they need to and give privacy. And I think we will have those other applications that come forward asking to use to convert shipping containers to housing types. And I think that it's time for us to have those conversations. So I'm very much in favor of the project, excited about it, and we'll see where we go from here.
Thank you, Commissioner Willy. Other questions or comments from commissioners? Motions? I'm sorry, Commissioner Carpenter.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. I agree with Commissioner Willy. I'm very grateful to Professor Rockhill and the work that's being done here to make this possible out there. I'm excited by the possibility, but the questions I'm raising and the answers I'm getting keep raising more questions in my mind that we're going to have to address. We're definitely going to have to come up with some standards for where different types of tiny homes are permissible. I don't want to see this turn into a haphazard process where do we like the applicant, and that's how we view the request. I think we need to have some more definite standards so it can be applied evenly across the city. I can see these requests coming up. Well, we've got the request for ADUs in different zoning districts now. We've got one pending out there to extend it possibly to RS5. That's where we're going to get, this is going to be very interesting with size limits for the secondary structure on the property. Shipping containers seem like they could meet that in many conditions, but what does that do to the character of the neighborhood? We've got design guidelines for one neighborhood. Can't use these types of containers there without complying with the design guidelines that were modified extensively. So I agree, this is a great beginning of the conversation, and I hope we can come up with some standardization to this instead of many different avenues that an applicant can come forward and request a tiny home as an ADU on the property. I'd like this to move towards some standardization of this and get rid of it.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. David Carter, Chair. Other observations or questions? Commissioner Willy.
We didn't hear from Ms. Bond. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add. I just didn't want to miss that if you did.
Thank you, Commissioner Willy. Ms. Bond, would you care to make any observations or comments?
Megan Vaughn, I'm Community Engagement Manager at the Lawrence Community Shelter. I'm finding the conversation very interesting. For my part, I would say that I'm excited for the opportunity to possibly give people a place to parent without every single other parent that lives at the shelter chiming in on how they should parent. And so in terms of the quality of life for people who are parenting children and being homeless, which is just, a pairing that is really difficult, this really does give us an opportunity to to give the children more than anybody else their own family life while they're, not in their own home. And I think it's really important. But I understand, like, you're doing your process, and I honor that. Thank you. But that's really where I'm coming from, as just wanting the community to support these people who are just having a rough time right at the moment, Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. David Carter, Chair. Commissioner Carpenter.
Jim Carpenter, Planning Commissioner. I don't mean to alarm you or make you worry. I think this is an incredible project. I've had a lot of trauma-informed care training. I've worked with a lot of people. Well, I was a legal aid attorney. I've worked with domestic violence. I understand what you're attempting to accomplish, and I think this is a great thing to be doing. The questions I'm raising are what come next. I mean, I know I'm going to vote for this tonight. I want to see the ability to have tiny houses in our community beyond just at the shelter, but my questions are geared towards what are we going to look at for the next time we get an application? And we've started to have these conversations in the past, but as I said earlier, nobody's requested to have these structures before. So you brought this issue back to us for the first time. And thank you for doing that, because it is something that we have to have. I think we should have as an available housing option throughout the city. We just have to know how to do it.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. Any other questions, comments, observations, motions? Commissioner Willy.
Commissioner Willie, I would make a motion if you're ready, Mr. Chair.
I'm ready, please.
Okay. I move to approve SUP 20-158, permitting 12 dwelling units located at 3655 East 25th Street, based on the findings presented in the staff report, and forwarding it to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval.
Thank you. Do I have a second? I think Commissioner Sinclair was first. And any further discussion? Well, before we vote, I'd just like to make a quick comment. David Carter, Chair, I want to agree with the commissioners who have spoken. I think this is really an incredible project. It's rare to see a single site with this kind of flexibility in both group housing and family housing. Families do have very particular needs. Homeless families have very particular needs that are generally not met by group shelters. I think I want to commend Professor Rockhill and his team for the quick response to, within this very brief and urgent timeline, and still proposing a solution that has long-term benefits. So I very strongly support this. I want to thank Commissioner Carpenter for the observations and questions about what happens next, because that is with affordable housing and accessory dwelling units on our agenda at some point in the future. I think this is going to be an important part of the conversation. So with that, any other discussion before we go to a vote? Okay, Jeff, could I ask you to call the roll, please?
Jeff Crick, Planning Development Services Director. Certainly. Commissioner Ashworth?
Yes.
Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes.
Commissioner Carter?
Yes.
Commissioner Payton?
Yes.
Commissioner Sands?
Yes.
Commissioner Sinclair?
Yes.
Commissioner Struckoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Willy?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0.
All right, thank you all. With that, our next items are, we have 2 deferrals and then any miscellaneous new or old business from either staff or commissioners.
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Staff has no new or old business to bring before the board this evening.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. David Carter, Chair. With that, I would like to call a recess until Wednesday evening at 6:30. And just for clarification, I believe we don't need to make any motion for that. Is that correct?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Service Director. I would actually recommend a motion and then a vote on that item, just so we have it up for the record.
Very good. Do I have a motion to recess until Wednesday?
Commissioner Sands, so moved.
Thank you. A second? Commissioner Ashworth, by hand motion. Jeff, could I ask you to call roll, please?
Jeff Crick, Planning and Development Services Director. Certainly. Commissioner Ashworth?
Yes.
Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes.
Commissioner Carter?
Yes.
Commissioner Payton?
Yes.
Commissioner Sands?
Yes.
Commissioner Sinclair?
Yes.
Commissioner Struckoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Willy?
Yes.
Motion to recess passes 8-0.
Thank you very much. We're recessed until Wednesday at 6:30. Everyone have a good evening.